You didn't already hear the announcement. If you purchase a ticket with the book, then your name is in one of these seats up here. You got it, Dr. Tracy? Okay. Thank you so much for being here. Okay. Welcome, everyone. How y'all feeling tonight? How y'all feeling tonight? Act like you know. My name is Michaela. I'm so happy to have you guys here. And we're so honored to welcome Dr. Gerald Horne here tonight for the first time in a while. Welcome back. Thank you. I won't say too much because I see a lot of familiar faces. Everyone is probably already familiar with Sankofa. I'll just say that we are celebrating our 25th year anniversary. Yes. And we're happy that Dr. Gerald Horne could join us within this year, so that makes it extra special. I'm going to introduce you, even though I know you don't need an introduction, but we're going to do it anyway. Dr. Gerald Horne is a prolific Marxist historian and author, considered one of the great historians of our time. Raised in St. Louis, Missouri, Horne received his undergraduate education at Princeton, received his PhD from Columbia University, and a JD from the University of California, Berkeley. He is currently the John J. and Rebecca Morris Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. Dr. Horne has written nearly 40 books. I'm sure it's like over that now, right? Yeah. Dealing with the confluence of African American history, communist history, the struggle for liberation, internationalism, imperialism, colonialism, racism, white supremacy, and fascism. Biographies written by Horne include The Lives of W.E.B. Du Bois, Benjamin Davis, Junior William L. Patterson, John Howard Lawson, and Ferdinand Smith, among others. Horne has also produced a number of volumes that examine U.S. history through a lens of settler colonialism, racial capitalism, white supremacy, and imperialism, and their genocidal impacts on Africans and indigenous Americans. So without further ado, I welcome Dr. Gerald Horne to present Acknowledging Radical Histories as well as Revolting Capital. Round of applause, please.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I certainly appreciate it. It's always great to be back in the district, to be back at Sankofa in particular. So my remarks will focus on a number of areas. First of all, I'm going to talk about some pressing current events, particularly, I'm afraid to say, since we may be on the verge of World War III. So I would be remiss if I ignored the elephant in the room, as they say in the United States. And then I'll talk about this book, Acknowledging Radical Histories. But I'm also going to talk about the book, Revolting Capital, which actually came out a few months ago on racism, radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. And in my remarks, to begin with, opening the first segment, I'm going to try to thread through some of the themes that are in that book on the 16th century, which is in the back, because I think that in order to understand why we may be on the verge of this cataclysmic conflict, you really need to go back a few centuries, not only to 1947-48, but actually go back to the 16th century, the 15th century, perhaps even back to the 13th century, the Crusades. Anyway, we'll get to that. So, first of all, with regard to the shenanigans on Capitol Hill with the coup caucus, or some might call it the cuckoo caucus, seizing the reins of power in the guise of Michael Johnson, who I'm sure you're familiar with, given his rather appalling record. Climate change denial, the intellectual architect in many ways of the attempted coup of January 6th. If he had his way, the LGBTQ community would be behind bars, possibly, not to mention depriving women of reproductive freedom, gutting Social Security. In fact, you may get a glimpse sooner rather than later of his atrocious record, since the government may be headed for another shutdown in a few weeks, in which case some folks who are dependent on government checks may be deprived, and if they're lucky, they'll be able to get some cat food to survive, and if they're not lucky, I guess they'll have to eat dog food. So this is a real crisis, and obviously it calls for various forms of mobilization, but barring that, and I know this is controversial because some of you may consider it to be defeatist, but I feel compelled, particularly to warn Black people in the district, Black people in Washington, D.C., that in addition to mobilizing and organizing, you should have a backup plan with regard to possibly having a site of exile, because the United States seems to be headed towards fascism, to be frank with you. And if that occurs, certainly an initial and major victim will be the melanin rich. And so once again, in order to combat this pestilence, we not only have to be organizing and mobilizing, but we also need a backup plan on the family level, the individual level, et cetera. And this ties in to the second issue, which is this crisis unfolding in historic Palestine with the U.S. naval flotilla, in the Eastern Mediterranean with attacks on Syria. Of course, the U.S. unauthorized, unwarranted forces on that territory. Just a few days ago, supposedly, an alleged purported Iranian proxy, speaking of the Houthis in Yemen, that supposedly launched a missile towards Israel, but apparently there had been a 9-hour firefight with U.S. forces in the Red Sea, which may be a precursor of what is to come. I found it very interesting today that at the United Nations General Assembly, where this resolution was passed that did not castigate the opposition forces in Gaza, I mean, that's to say, Hamas forces and their allies, that there were a number of abstentions. Of course, the United States voted against. It's in the General Assembly, not the Security Council, so it's non-binding. It doesn't necessarily have the force of international law that the Security Council resolution would have. But I found it very curious that France voted in favor of that resolution. Now, of course, Macron, he was noted for his verbal tap dances. When he was in Israel a few days ago, he says that the Israelis should wage war without mercy against Hamas, but within rules, for example. That's a typical sort of waffling. But France is oftentimes a bellwether in terms of historic change. The very term détente, that is to say, this supposed easing of tensions between the then Soviet Union and the North Atlantic countries, obviously that's a French word. France under Charles de Gaulle recognized People's Republic of China years before the United States did. Going back to the 16th century when there were all these religious conflicts, not least between Protestants and Catholics and Christians and Islam, France tried to cut a deal with the leading Muslim power, speaking of Turkey, or Turkey, excuse me. So I found it very interesting because I think it doesn't take an oracle or a seer to see October 7th as a kind of turning point, not only in the history of the region, but perhaps in world history. And as I will seek to outline in a few moments, I won't speak too long on this, there's a kind of symmetry involved in this, because as I say in my 16th century book, one of the reasons that many of us are in North America speaking English, as opposed to not being here at all, or perhaps speaking Spanish. 1492, obviously Spain had first movers advantage. But what happens is that this Copernican change in the world with the looting and plundering of the Americas takes place simultaneously with the rise of the Protestant sect, as it was then called, 1517 with Martin Luther. It sweeps into London. By the 1530s, I'm sure many of you know the story about supposedly King Henry VIII wanting to get divorces, and Vatican was not game. And so, of course, he defects to Protestants, but of course, he's able to plunder a lot of the Catholic property in Spain, in England too. But in any case, that ignites these religious conflicts. And Spain comes with an eyelash of overthrowing the monarchy in London in 1588. But part of the key to the rise of the Anglosphere, with England, then Britain, the British Empire, and then passing on the baton, perhaps in the 20th century, perhaps even as late as the late 19th century to the United States, was this historic compromise with the Jewish community. Because England had expelled its Jewish population at the end of the 13th century, but at the 16th century it was under the gun. Spain was pursuing the Inquisition, that is to say, become Catholic, die, or be tortured, which was aimed not only at the Jewish community, which of course ignites this Jewish diaspora, the Sephardim. I mean, in other words, they're fleeing. But also it's kind of payback to the Islamic forces who had been ruling the Iberian Peninsula for 700 years, up until 1492. And so London ignites this historic compromise with the Jewish diaspora, welcoming them. Holland, Netherlands, does something similar because they become Protestant as well. That baton is then passed on to the revolting spawn of London, speaking of this nation now known as the United States of America. Now, of course, we know that there has been a certain kind of bumpiness with regard to the embrace of the Jewish community in North America. For example, one of my future books, assuming I survive like the rest of us, will concern this conflict in North America, and then also in the North Atlantic generally, when Washington was charging the Jewish community in Algiers with collaborating with the Muslims in terms of enslaving the Christians as they were sailing south to enslave Africans. Sometimes they wound up in the curious position of being enslaved themselves. So, and then of course the Leo Frank case a century or so ago in Georgia, where a Jewish man is lynched, and that leads to a collaboration between the Jewish community and the NAACP, which I assume continues to this very day, culminating with the United States getting behind State of Israel 47-48, with the former Howard professor, Ralph Bunche, playing a key role, and a typical transition from the left, where he was positioned in the 1930s, to leapfrogging to the precursor of the CIA, Office of Strategic Services, in the 1940s, and then to newly born United Nations by 1945. And then he's number two to the Swedish diplomat, Count Folke Bernadotte, who's operating in historic Palestine on behalf of the United Nations. And the Zionist terrorists decide to blow him up. Ralph Bunche takes his place. Perhaps they felt that he'd be more pliable. Perhaps he was. And of course, he gets the Nobel Prize, Peace Prize, and becomes, we are told, a folk hero amongst Black Americans. But as the late Mary Baraka used to say, you can't eat Ralph Bunche for lunch. So I'm not sure what that was all about. But in any case, this is part of this historic alliance between Israel and the United States. Israel, a kind of an unsinkable aircraft carrier in a very sensitive oil-rich region. And as I was suggesting, there's a sort of symmetry between the collaboration with the Jewish diaspora, which takes many forms, some of which are very sensitive. I'll mention them if interrogated. Some of which are very sensitive. So there's sort of symmetry between this rise in the Anglosphere hundreds of years ago as part of this compromise with the Jewish diaspora, and then we're on the verge right now of another of a possible shift. As we speak, we're watching it unfold as we speak. And as I said, I think the French vote in the General Assembly might be a harbinger of things to come in light of the fact that they're oftentimes ahead of the other capitalist countries and the other North Atlantic countries in terms of sensing that there are shifts. And I should also make this point, that you probably know that in a full-blooded sense, the Zionist project takes off with Theodor Herzl at the end of the 19th century. By the way, I'm writing this book on the Panthers, Eldridge Cleaver. Eldridge Cleaver was a big fan of Theodor Herzl, believe it or not. He used to study his works for whatever reason. We can talk about that too if you're interested. So, he had this idea that anti-Jewish fervor could not be eradicated, what is popularly referred to as anti-Semitism, and therefore you need this Jewish state. But as he was speaking, obviously he didn't understand the construction of whiteness, the construction of white supremacy, that is to say, this militarized identity politics that arises in North America, where those who have been warring on the shores of Europe, English versus Irish, English versus Scot, English versus Welsh, British versus German, German versus Pole, Russian versus Austrian, Austrian versus Hungarian, Serb versus Croat, Northern Italian versus, all of a sudden, in a kind of magic, once they cross the Atlantic, they assume this new identity of whiteness, which then morphs into white supremacy. And that includes, of course, ultimately the Jewish population, which the fact that there are many Jewish people who have done quite well in North America tends to undermine the core concept of Zionism and Theodor Herzl. In fact, people were arguing for years, until maybe the last 75 years, that it wasn't a good idea to have all the Jewish people in one place because it might be easier to attack them. In any case, let me conclude this segment by making a couple of points. One is that there's going to be a lot of finger pointing and bitter recriminations, no matter how this crisis that's becoming a catastrophe unfolds. You see it right now with regard to the persecution and harassment of college students on various campuses. The university president of the University of Pennsylvania may not survive this crisis, etc. Many black intellectuals are hiding under their desks, hoping nobody calls them, ask for a comment. A guy I know at Cornell, Russell Rickford, he wrote this book, We Are an African People. So he's in seclusion right now because of comments he made. All his classes were suspended. No, I mean, it's very serious. This is a very serious crisis. So I see that in the short term. But in the long term, there's going to have to be a reckoning. There's going to be a reckoning, I think, with the Zionist wing of the U.S. ruling class. Because I think that they overplayed their hand, just like Israel has overplayed its hand, which oftentimes tends to happen. One of the reasons why we are, quote, free, quote unquote, is that the enslavers in North America, they overplayed their hand. They could have cut a deal with Lincoln in 1860, 1861. They decided to go for the gusto, overthrow them all together, take over the whole country. And then, of course, they lost their most valuable property. Property that they did not receive compensation for, which is still infuriating to them, which is one of the reasons there's so much terrorism today against black people. Because when you take somebody's property in a capitalist country and don't compensate them, they get furious, ferocious. But in any case, the Zionist elements have overreached. They helped to undermine Jesse Jackson's campaign. He's a bigot. Jeremy Corbyn in London, former leader of the Labour Party, prime minister in waiting. He's a bigot. He had to go. Now Keir Starmer is taking his place and hasn't hardly said a mumbling word about this crisis unfolding in historic Palestine. They even had the audacity to go after James A. Baker III, a card-carrying member of the U.S. ruling elite, Secretary of State under the first George W. Bush, who was trying to resolve the crisis decades ago. He's a bigot. I mean, they've overreached, they've extended themselves, and there's going to be a reckoning. I thought that there was a reckoning, and I've mentioned this before, a few decades ago when there was a typical capitalist crisis, and I thought that the way the crisis was going to be resolved was by purging people like Michael Milken, the junk bond king in Southern California. He was sent to jail, billionaire, Jewish American. Ivan Boesky, Dennis Levine. I may have been mistaken in that regard, but the fact that the United States keeps telling us that China is the ball game, but yet they're bogged down in Ukraine, now about to get bogged down in historic Palestine. The ruling class in this country can't go on like this. And I should also mention the US left, which should be in for a certain amount of self-criticism, because some of our Euro-American friends, particularly on the US left, they like to talk about this concept they call identity politics. You know, anytime Black people organize, it's identity politics. You know, Black Lives Matter. But some of the same people who throw out what they consider to be that insult, they rarely talk. They normalize whiteness, which is militarized identity politics of the first order, which helped to depopulate this continent and liquidate the indigenous population. I mean, if Israel is not identity politics, I don't know what is. I mean, here you have a state based on a particular exclusivist religious and or ethno-religious identity. That's not identity politics. Black Lives Matter is. I mean, there's going to have to be a reckoning within the progressive forces in the United States, because, you know, we can't go on like this with this sort of nonsense. I guess you can afford nonsense if you seem to be a battleship cruising along, but now that's on the verge of World War III. I'm not sure if that's really viable. Okay, that's that segment. So now let me turn to these books. So this is the newest book. It's an attempt in many ways to push forward younger scholars, because as the saying goes, I've seen more yesterdays than I'll see tomorrows. And it's time for the younger generation to step forward. So I did this book with this younger scholar to try to push him forward. I have another book. It was supposed to be out already, but it got delayed in production. It's called I Dare Say, the Gerald Horne Reader. It's a collection of articles I've written over the decades, including, and I can talk about these articles, including an article I wrote some years ago on the lumpen, a core concept of the Black Panther Party. But I try to historicize that concept, talk about the lumpen in a broader sense, helping to shed light on why in ordinary discourse in the United States today, the term gangsters has become sort of a compliment and a verb. Same with pimping. I never would have imagined that that would occur. But shows you how much I know. And you know, so that latter book, which will be out hopefully in days, also deals with Watts Uprising in 1965, anti-apartheid movement, the Ukraine crisis, which I try to put in the context of the historic conflict between the Western European countries, which were getting rich and fat on the plunder of Africa and the Americas, but were not necessarily the main power on the European continent, which was Russia. So Napoleon tries to resolve that conflict, gets defeated about 200 years ago. Then there's the Crimea War, the 1850s, where Britain, France, and the sick man of Europe, Turkey, gang up. They do make some progress there. All the while, of course, Russia is moving east. You know, Vladivostok, its window in the Pacific, is established in 1860. Then there's London financing the Japanese attack on Russia in 1904, which Ho Chi Minh, Nehru, Du Bois all paid careful and close attention to because Japan won, which they saw as a signal in terms of the impending and incipient decline of Europe. Operation Barbarossa, June 1941, the Cold War with the United States, and then the latest chapter being this Ukraine crisis. So that's all in this reader. Now, this book, it's conversations. I deal a lot with my background. I'm from St. Louis, growing up in St. Louis, and parents from the heart of darkness of Jim Crow and slavery, speaking in Mississippi, growing up on stories and tales about the horrors of Mississippi, which helped to shape my consciousness. We were a working class family. My father was a truck driver, teamster, used to bill itself as the largest union in the capitalist world. Of course, he lost his pension because the leaders were in bed with organized crime, the lumpen, in other words, and they frittered all the pension money away in Las Vegas and elsewhere. So that's the background that helped to shape me, which also helping to shape me was starting to work as a child laborer, which I don't recommend. I'm wholly and totally against child labor. But I was a child laborer, beginning at the age of 6 or 7, selling newspapers, St. Louis Post-Dispatch, which is still in business, getting robbed, etc., which is on a regular basis, which is quite an experience. And but then I began to read the newspapers, which is still a habit. Although admittedly, it was just comic strips on the sports page. I don't read the comic strips anymore, but I still read the sports page, the first thing in the morning. And so that book is partly biographical, autobiographical, but then I talk about some of the projects that I stumbled onto. The book about the Associated Negro Press, Claude Barnett, which up until the 1960s had a news gathering operation with correspondents all over the world. In some ways, Black Americans were better informed then, in the analog era, than today, when we all have these, well, many of us have these smartphones, and you can find out what's happening instantaneously all over the world. But it was a for-profit enterprise, which meant it had contradictions. I cite one letter from when Claude Barnett in the 1950s. He's writing a letter to the Belgians, who then control the Congo, the Belgian Congo, larger in territory than Western Europe. And they're plundering the Congo, and so Claude Barnett is denouncing them. But then at the end of the letter, he says, I'm a collector of African art. And so you think we can do a deal with regard to that particular enterprise? So obviously that compromises him, because you can't denounce somebody on the one hand and try to do a deal with them on the other. Oftentimes what happens is that the profit-making impulse triumphs. And then he gets caught up in the contradictions of Jim Crow. That is to say, in those days, the mainstream press, including your own Washington Post, they would not hire Black reporters, to put it mildly. So that gave him a sort of a corner on the market. But as that began to change, Black journalists had more options, and it really wrecked his business model, part of the contradictions of the Jim Crow era. So I talk about that book, I talk about my jazz book and how I came to that subject, basically growing up in a household where the music was prominent and prevalent. My younger brother, for example, is a professional musician and still doing it. And then we grew up in St. Louis, up the street from the Bowie family. Some of you may be familiar with Lester Bowie, a late trumpeter, and his brother, who used to play with my brother in bands, Joseph Bowie, he's a bones man, plays trombone. He used to have this group Defunct. I don't know if you recall that. So that was sort of the precursor to my doing this book on the music. And let's see. That's about a half hour. So I'll stop here. Is that okay, Madam Scarlett? Okay. And yeah, if there are any comments or questions, we can entertain those for a while. So thank you for your attention. Sorry? Oh, yeah, I forgot that. Right. Well, believe it or not, I first Washington, D.C. in 1966, believe it or not, for the Howard Homecoming. And I've always been fascinated with Washington, D.C. I've been coming here for years to do research on various projects because of Moreland Spingarn, across the street, because of the National Archives, down the street and in College Park, because of the Library of Congress, where I was this morning. So Washington has always been a magnet for me, which led me inevitably to this book, Revolting Capital, Racism, Radicalism in Washington, D.C. It tells a number of stories. Howard University plays a prominent and pivotal role in these pages, particularly the federal government, the Dixiecrats, putting pressure on Howard University, not least because of what I referenced a few moments ago, the presence of then radical professors like Ralph Bunche, for example, W. Alpheus Hunton, who we need to know more about, and others of that ilk. But this book also tells a story in terms of Howard about how Howard traditionally and routinely attracted students from the Pan-African world. And there hangs a tale, because what happens is that the terroristic police department and other authorities oftentimes had difficulty, for whatever reason, distinguishing Black people from Nigeria from Black people who have roots in Washington. The problem was, if they are battering a Nigerian student, then it becomes an international incident in the context of the Cold War, where they're trying to win hearts and minds in the ideological contestation with the socialist camp. So this creates a dynamic whereby Jim Crow is forced to retreat. And of course, they come up with all of these cockamamie schemes beforehand, like giving African diplomats a button to wear on their lapels to show that they were Black Americans, for example. But you know, Black Americans could counterfeit those buttons, adopt the phony accents, and then be served in a restaurant or hotel, for example. So that whole system was untenable and had to retreat. And some of its first retreats were right here because of the international presence. So I tell many stories in that book, Revolting Capital. And needless to say, for those of you who are in the deep, and there's a lot of history about Maryland and Virginia as well. Speaking of which, one of the reasons I'm in DC now, I'm working on this book on slavery in Washington, DC. And I expect to find similar contradictions and tensions. I expect to find the enslaved collaborate. What we already know. I wrote about this in my book, Negro Comrades of the Crown, when there was a conflict during the 1812 War, and the British, August 1814, torched the city, torched the White House, sending President Madison and his garrulous spouse Dolly fleeing into the streets one step ahead of the posse. And many of the enslaved collaborating with the Redcoats and then jumping on British boats and sailing to Trinidad and Tobago, where their descendants continued to reside. So we already know part of the story, but I expect to find other chapters in terms of this collaboration with the real and imagined enemies of the United States of America, which of course goes back to the colonial period, goes back to the 1776 war, goes back to Stonewall's Rebellion in South Carolina, circa 1740, which is instigated in part by the Spanish in Florida. So anyway, that's Revolting Capital, and I guess we can now open up.
We ask that you do use your outside voice when you ask the questions. We're going to let Dr. Horne use the microphone.
Dr. Horne, first, I respect and appreciate the quality of your books. You put out so many books, and the quality never suffered. I think that's impressive to me as a lady. Having said that, I would like to know something about your research method, if you would share with us, because you put out so much work. Your research method must be out of this world. Perhaps you write a book about that one day.
Well, I usually work on 3 or 4 projects at once. And sorry, I missed that. Oh, that's it. And you know, when you're doing research in these archives, and keep in mind, for the longest, Black people were barred from archives. That's one of the reasons why the history has been so skewed. So when you're in an archive and you're going through these pages, every second you're asking yourself, should I take a note on this? And if so, how does it fit with my overall thesis? You're doing those mental calculations constantly. And if I take a note, should I paraphrase it? Or should I take quotes because the language is electric and it'll be gripping for the reader if I quote it directly? And obviously, the ability to travel helps a bit. Before there was a time when I didn't have as many resources as I have now. And I tried to do, when I did that book on Los Angeles, the Watts Uprising, I was, of course, living in Southern California. When I did those books on Hollywood, when I began, I was living in Southern California. So once I got more resources, I was able to travel more. And then also what helps, you know, I did these books on Southern Africa. And, you know, I lived in Zimbabwe in 1995. And so I knew the feel. I'd done a lot of anti-apartheid work in my youth. So I sort of knew the players, knew the subject, knew the issues. So that helps. So every book has a backstory. When I did the biography of Shirley Graham Du Bois, that was by accident, because I had known her son, David Du Bois. And I bumped into him, and he told me about her archive that was then in Cairo. So I was able to rustle up resources and go to Cairo. That was the nucleus of that book. Her papers are now at Harvard, for example. So every project has a backstory.
If I could follow up real quick, I know somebody else, would you talk a little bit about the radicalization of politics now in the current era, how you see that going? What do you see?
What I see now is very disturbing, this persecution of students. You saw that Uncle Tim Scott called for any students protesting U.S. policy towards Israel who are not U.S. nationals be deported, and that federal aid to their campuses be cut off. So be careful at Howard with regard to your demonstrations, because, you know, the Dixiecrats love to prey on Howard. That's part of their ideological makeup. So in the short term, as I said, it's going to be difficult. But in the long term, as I said, I mean, I see a real crock-up coming in the U.S. ruling class because of this crisis, which I don't think that they'll be able to survive intact, which will then create openings for their opposition, which is us. But, you know, we'll see. But in the meantime, as I said, everybody should have a backup plan in case this doesn't work out.
She said, take a bite of your sandwich.
Oh, by the way, I had ordered, I think it's banana bread.
If you want to ask a question, if you can please stand up.
It's going to be really quick. I heard that Minister Farrakhan filed a lawsuit.
Yeah.
So can you speak about that?
Yeah, I haven't read the Final Call article. Apparently, it's a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit against the Simon Wiesenthal Center, which is sort of a Holocaust center, study center, Jewish Holocaust Study Center. It's against the Anti-Defamation League, B'nai B'rith, which, by the way, has been very close to a segment of the Black leadership. I saw in the Amsterdam News just a few days ago that Jonathan Greenblatt, their leader, spoke at Al Sharpton's shindig in Manhattan and congratulated Sharpton and the Black leaders there for their support with regard to this crisis that's now unfolding. So that's all I know about the lawsuit. He's suing him apparently, I guess, for defamation. I assume it's a political project because it's difficult for me to see him prevailing in that lawsuit, but I assume it's a political project attempting to raise consciousness, etc. But that's really all I know about it. Yes, sir.
Your thoughts on Cornel West's?
Well, I have to say, you know, I should preface my remarks by saying that I'm not the most impartial observer because I know Cornel, he's been helpful to me. And so you may be better off asking a more impartial observer. But, you know, actually, if you look at the New York Times today, they have a big article about Cornel. Actually, they didn't quote what I had said, but that's okay. One of the points that I had made is that folks in the United States apparently slept through civics classes and don't necessarily understand the operations of U.S. presidential elections, which is 50 plus different elections. As Hillary Clinton could tell you, you can get the most votes and lose. It's not an unusual occurrence. For a person like myself, who votes in the state of Texas, where the Republicans have a stranglehold, not only a stranglehold, but you know, they're really moving in some very dangerous directions in the state of Texas that are quite ominous. I think that's one of the reasons why I have an idea of a backup plan in the forefront of my consciousness. And so I don't think the Democrats are going to prevail in the state of Texas in 2024. I think that's a safe wager. So why not challenge that bankrupt status quo with another party? We all know that in these U.S. presidential elections, there are about 10 states that issue. So what I told this reporter, I said, what Cornel should do, he should wrong foot the opposition by saying, I'm not going to campaign in these 10 states. I'll probably get on the ballot anyway because of shenanigans. I'll campaign in 40 states. And, you know, I'll campaign in Mississippi, where the Republicans have a stranglehold. And, I'll campaign in the Native American areas, Montana, Dakota, Idaho, etc. Perhaps even California, because I don't think that the Republicans are going to do well if history is any guide in the state of California. So that's the assessment I provided. For whatever reason, they decided it was not worthy of printing. So be it.
Dr. Horne,
Mm-hmm.
I have two questions.
Mm-hmm.
One question was about your thoughts about O'Malley and Shatala and the
Oh, yeah.
Uhuru movement and the relationship in Black movement and dissenting in political views. And the other one was about dispensationalism regarding the new Speaker of the House, Johnson, and the support of the far right and eventful movement with regard to the colony of Israel. How, from my point of view, my limited point of view, it seems like their support is like kind of like a disingenuous support that they want whatever they want there. But I wanted to get your.
Was a stepping stone to heaven.
Yes. Yeah. I wanted to get your position on both of those.
Well, I'm glad you asked the first question because it gives me an opportunity to say that I do these interviews on the Pacifica station in Los Angeles, KPFK, and kpfk.org, and then we post them on this non-commercial YouTube channel, the Activist News Network. And today, we interviewed someone from Chairman O'Malley's organization. They're having a Black March on the White House. Actually, I took one of their cards. It was up front. In November 4th. Yeah. And, you know, he's being charged with various transgressions, as you probably know, allegations about his closeness to Moscow. And they raided 2 of his sites in St. Petersburg, Florida, and St. Louis. I should also say, in the interest of full disclosure, that I've been doing these interviews for years, not the ones in Los Angeles. This is this brother up in Toronto who's tied to the African People's Socialist Party. We do them every Sunday. I'll do it this Sunday, as a matter of fact. On Black Power 96, this is a station they have in St. Petersburg. We review the events of the week. It's very dangerous. I mean, they're having to raise a lot of money to defend themselves, and I think they deserve our support. That's my humble opinion. Now, I spoke to Speaker Johnson a few moments ago at the top. It's another step towards fascism, quite frankly. When you put the intellectual architect of the attempted coup in control, even though his predecessor, McCarthy, he was waffling post January 6th, but then he made his peace with Mr. Trump. But I guess that wobbliness was not a good sign for the coup caucus, the cuckoo caucus. And so they're putting in Speaker Johnson. It's very interesting, you know, Speaker Johnson, he uses the fact that he has this adopted black son as part of his political persona. Not unlike Amy Coney Barrett of the U.S. Supreme Court. I guess that's becoming a fashionable accessory, so to speak. So at least, well, perhaps the good news is that perhaps at least one black person will survive. Let's be optimistic. Let's be optimistic. Any other questions?
As a historian,
Mm-hmm.
who knows so much more than any one discipline, as a historian who knows so much more than any one particular discipline, and given the way that you're speaking to, civil discourse is now very civil, one of the things that's always absent is an understanding of the term or category Semite, right, which is captured for a self-white supremacist project, right? And so I was wondering, even just as a historian, could you begin the process of sort of recapturing how that's been used, what it's been needed, and how it's been mobilized, for very different politics in this so-called secular sphere?
Well, it's not a very precise term, but even in the popular sense, it could be used to describe Arabs or people also from that part of the world. It being sort of captured by the a segment of the Jewish community in this phrase anti-Semitism could be analogized to how Israeli culture oftentimes appropriates Arab culture and rebrands it as Israeli culture. You see that with regard to food, for example. You see it in many different categories. One of the things I find troubling is the response of some of our Black Christian friends, Black American Christian friends, to this entire crisis, because Israel is also notorious, as the Panthers used to say, for vamping on Christians. in what the Christians call the Holy Land. And yet, many of our black Christians, I just mentioned Reverend Al Sharpton, for example. He was just entertaining Jonathan Greenblatt. You would think that many of our black Christian friends would be sensitive to how their fellow Christians are being maltreated and mistreated under Israeli jurisdiction. But I guess that's asking too much. But I don't think that's sustainable. I think that ultimately they're going to have a lot of explaining to do. And the sooner the better. Yes, sir.
Take a bite, man. Well, I'll ask you right quick.
Okay.
Wonder if you have any thoughts about these current kind of developments around federalism, particularly given your work, the latest book on Texas you wrote, looking at the governor of Texas going to spend state funds to build a wall, testing the limits of federalism. I wonder if you have any thoughts about whether or not in the federal framework, particularly given how the Supreme Court is surprised with the Alabama decision on voting rights, and I guess Judge Jones in Georgia this week, of course, with his case saying you got to draw another district in Georgia, and then now North Carolina, they're going to try to, gerrymander. Any thoughts on that tension between this persistent kind of white nationalism in this country, reached its peak in the 1860s, but are they going to tear this thing up? And are the people at the federal level, perhaps John Robertson, getting a little nervous about it, maybe pulling back from their project? Any thoughts generally about this question?
Yeah, I mean, I've been reading these articles about Kavanaugh. Apparently Kavanaugh is pumping the brakes a little bit, although I wouldn't be willing to wager my bank account on that continuing. But certainly, we should not be surprised that these challenges to federal power, which has been a part of the program of the reactionaries going back to before the Civil War, is now continuing in Texas, particularly since Texas, as I say in the Texas book, was in many ways the locomotive of the Confederacy. In many ways, it was the southern state least damaged, least devastated by the U.S. Civil War. In many ways, because of its relationship with French-occupied Mexico, it was able to get supplies to support the rest of the Confederacy. Given the fact that Texas starts off as an independent country, the Lone Star Republic, seceding from Mexico in 1836, not least because Mexico under the president of African descent, Vicente Guerrero, had moved towards abolition of slavery, which was not appreciated by Sam Houston, Stephen F. Austin, and the other freebooters who seceded. And in many ways, the secession of Texas from Mexico was analogous to the secession of Dixie from the United States. So we should not be surprised by the news just being reported that Texas is now trying to encroach upon federal authority with regard to immigration. Supposedly, the federal government has plenary power with regard to immigration. Texas says no. Texas has a role. And once again, with this U.S. Supreme Court, you never know how they're going to rule, since they're so corrupt and just politicians in robes. But, I started off that Texas book with a vignette, which I think illustrates the dangers of fascism, and also should cause any who are paying attention to really think more carefully about the class question. Because the book starts off with a conflict between the federal government and the settlers in Texas over indigenous policy. The federal government wants to put the indigenous on reservations. The settlers say no, they should be liquidated. And then they begin to liquidate federal government officials who object. Then they move on to liquidate the indigenous population. In that book, there is a long footnote, about a half a page, where I felt that I felt like it was my responsibility to list all of the different ethnic groups or tribes, as they say in the United States, who were liquidated, gone with the wind, no more. It's a very disturbing and troubling trend. And with regard to the class question, it's just like when the Cherokees were expropriated in the southeast quadrant of North America. The Cherokees have tried to assimilate, in the sense of becoming Christians, developing an alphabet, newspapers, which are now a valuable source, in terms of enslaving Africans, even. They still had to go. And oftentimes, their mansions in Georgia were then seized by European settlers just off the boat. And so that's part of the contradiction of the United States, which is that, by the way, I'm glad you raised this. In today's Wall Street Journal, they have a sort of a primer on the term settler colonialism. I was very pleased to see that. It shows that, because and what's good about that, of course, is they point out that term is not only applicable to Israel, it's applicable to this country, which means in a certain sense, quite typically, the Wall Street Journal is more perceptive than many of our friends on the left. That term is alien to them. Settler colonialism, what's that? But in any event, under this settler colonial rubric, what happens is it feeds class collaboration. Because it's just like those who are defined as white. Many of them, of whatever class background, felt that it was in their interest to seize the land of the Native American. You could move into a mansion, in fact, right off the boat. And as I said, the settler colonialists here in North America, they were even willing to make accommodations to those who were demonized in Europe, speaking the Jewish population. But they could be welcomed into the hollow halls of whiteness, and many of them could do quite well for themselves. And it's obviously that complicates, and as Jeff Bezos, your homeboy, says, complexifies the class question, which once again has eluded and evaded the attention of many of our friends on the left.
Could you just say a little bit more about some of the cracks in the ruling class that you are seeing and that your research brings out in your perspective? And I've also been reading about Jamel Bowie in the New York Times has been writing about these counter-majoritarian impulses and our potential opportunity to get rid of them. So some of the cracks you're seeing in the elite class domination and how we might exploit those.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Jamel Bowie. His columns are oftentimes very interesting. And even Charles Blow, just the other day, he wrote about the crisis in historic Palestine and the challenges that presents. You see many cracks. I mean, look at China policy. It's obvious that, so what happens a few decades ago, because of this overdetermination of Moscow, the United States cuts a deal with China, which then accelerates its anti-Sovietism, which has manifestations all over the planet. And in return, it gets massive foreign direct investment, which has now created this juggernaut. And in that process, you see that Apple has become heavily dependent upon China for production. Tim Cook, Tim Cook, the CEO, has been spending a lot of time there. As a matter of fact, if I were a stock picker, I would ask you to short your Apple stock, because I think that assuming that even if Trump doesn't return, But particularly if he does return, the foreign policy in part will involve a sort of conciliation with Moscow and focusing like a laser beam on China. And as a result, those corporations, which have profited handsomely over the deal with China, like Apple, like Tesla, for example, which already is being challenged by BYD of China, which, by the way, Warren Buffett, the Oracle of Omaha, is a major investor in BYD. So obviously you have Warren Buffett and Elon Musk at odds. Speaking of cracks, obviously Elon Musk has developed a number of antagonists, not least in the Zionist wing of the U.S. ruling class, because they're raking him over the coals because of what they see as what's happening on X or Twitter nowadays. They feel that it's become a kind of fountainhead of anti-Jewish fervor, for example. He's really being dragged in the New York Times as a result. Of course, the New York Times, as you know, is controlled by the Sulzberger family, a major linchpin of the Jewish American elite in the United States of America. I mean, there are all sorts of rifts and cracks in the edifice of the U.S. ruling class, but the question is, are we able to take advantage of that? And that then goes to the question of the intelligence, the aptitude, the organizing of our side. And I won't object if any of you suggest that we have an uphill climb ahead. Yes, sir.
Hey, good to see you, Dr. Horne, as always. I wanted to ask you, could you give us
a little louder?
Sure. Could you give us some sentiments on the paradigm shift over in the Sahel with the Francophone countries, and how do you see that playing out? And what's your sentiments on Black America being almost silent on the topic?
Well, excuse me, the latter point is easy to address. As I say quite frequently, when Jim Crow was eroded approximately 75 years ago, it was part of a compromise. I call it the compromise of 1954, just like you have the compromise of 1850. That is to say, in return for eroding the more horrible aspects of Jim Crow, U.S. apartheid, you throw overboard people like Robeson, for example. And part of the deal that results is not a sustained critique of U.S. imperialism, not a sustained critique of U.S. foreign policy. There's an intermittent critique, the Vietnam War, for example, but even there, the NAACP was not necessarily on board with that critique. In fact, they were one of the major critics of Dr. King, for example. I just mentioned that with regard to the historic crisis in Palestine, Israel, the Black organizations are not necessarily on board, although I should add a major footnote, which is that apparently the 18 members of Congress who signed the recent letter calling for a ceasefire or humanitarian pause disproportionately were members of the Congressional Black Caucus. I should say that in all fairness. But in any event, there's really not a sustained critique with regard to that. And remind me of your question again.
I wanted to ask you, how did you see the paradigm shift over in the Sahel area?
Oh, yes, right. Sorry.
And ECOWAS and
Right.
whole.
Yeah. Sorry. So you're referring, I'm sure, to the events of late July 2023. There's regime change in Niamey, Niger. President Bazoum, who is a member of a minority group, Arab population. Of course, that gets into a lot of complications. He's overthrown by the military. And I tried to put this in the context once again, of contestation between France and the United States, because it seems like the new regime in Niamey is willing to play ball with Uncle Sam. They're not willing to play ball with France. The French ambassador has left. French troops have been asked to leave. As the crisis was unfolding, the United States parachuted an ambassador into Niamey. Apparently, the U.S. bases, particularly the drone bases, are still intact. Of course, there was all this talk about ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, led by Nigeria, intervening. Nigeria has been cooperating with France on a number of different levels, particularly, we are told, with regard to combating piracy in the Gulf of Guinea. But apparently, President Tinubu, who has his own problems, the High Court has just ruled that he can continue because he was being challenged. And he got elected. You think these elections in the United States is shambolic? You said, look at these elections in Nigeria. I mean, you had masked armed men come into voting precincts and grab the ballot boxes and abscond, for example. You think the United States is bad. In any case, he's apparently going to survive. There are all these stories coming out during the height of the crisis, August 2023, that Vice President Harris was putting pressure on President Tinubu, because President Tinubu has some very shady, has a shady background. There's this Nigerian filmmaker and writer whose name escapes me right now. Anybody recall? Anyway, he's been doing all this research because apparently Tinubu was a student at Chicago State University, and then in the late 1970s, he splits. Apparently, he's implicated in some sort of drug deal, leaves $500,000 on the table. Apparently, the United States has records that they won't release about Tinubu, which was the backdrop for Vice President Harris pressuring him. Apparently, the quid pro quo being that unless you do what we say, we're going to release these records to this guy who's investigating you. So that sent him to make him rather compliant. So, but fortunately, they did not intervene. And of course, that was a good reason, because the Algerians came out in support of the Niger regime. Part of the contestation concerns this pipeline built from Nigeria through Niger to the Mediterranean for natural gas, in light of their trying to boycott the Russian market. Despite all this rhetoric, they're still addicted to Russian natural gas, but they would like to develop alternatives. So that has been a major issue. Of course, the neighbors, Mali and Burkina, came out in support of Niger. And then, as we were trying to digest that, you had the regime change in Gabon. With the Bongo dynasty toppled. Apparently, the successor is one of your neighbors. Apparently, he has he's property in Hyattsville, Silver Spring. So you all might bump into him and say, "Go." But so I think that even France is not necessarily disappointed with that regime change. But anyway, back to Washington. So there's this deal that was cut between France and the United States with regard to Africa. Whereas the deal was, with France, if you can keep the lid on these countries, well, you can continue. But if you can't keep the lid on, what good are you? And so you've had these coups, as I've said it, changes of regime. France can't keep the lid on. Washington thinks that France is not up to the task. You should reference here what I just said about the vote of the General Assembly today. And there was a contestation between France and the United States over the multi-billion-dollar submarine deal with Australia, where France thought they had a deal. The United States jumped in, took the deal. And, of course, Mr. Biden tried to make up to France by inviting President Macron and his spouse to a state dinner. The most recent one was for Australia. You may have noticed just the other day. Interestingly enough, President Macron, during that trip to the United States, this is about 9 or 10 months ago, decided to visit New Orleans. Now, I only mention that because so that you got to keep your eye on the French. Recall that under President de Gaulle, that he came to Quebec, where there is still a lingering sentiment to secede from Canada, and basically endorsed it. And so if any of you have roots in Louisiana or New Orleans, you might want to try to talk to the French. You might wind up being the head of an independent Louisiana. Stranger things have happened. Anything else? Well,
Nothing like a moment to eat.
no, I'm good. I'm good.
No, take your time, sir.
Yes, sir. Oh, yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Dr. Horne. Thank you for being here tonight. I'm wondering if you could share your analysis on this new economic system of BRICS and the vast support that it's getting across Africa.
Yeah. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Now it's the BRICS plus 6 with Egypt, Ethiopia, United Arab Emirates, Saudis, Iran, Argentina. And of course, we got to watch this election coming up in Argentina because this wild man, Milei, gets in power. I don't see how that country could continue in the BRICS. I mean, he wants to formalize this major South American country as a sort of neocon of the United States. So it would have an enemy within the gates because BRICS plus 6 is a kind of alternative to the group of 7 led by the United States, the Western European countries, Japan. They have a Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which you can see as a counterpoint to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization led by Washington. You might have noticed that in recent days, there have been high-level discussions between the Iranian leadership and the Russian leadership in light of the U.S. flotilla in that part of the world. Apparently, China has sent a flotilla of its own to the vicinity. So we may, and underline may, be, as I said, going through this shift, this global shift that doesn't happen very often. This shift being away from U.S. and North Atlantic domination. You see this perhaps with regard to the rise in borrowing costs in the United States, which is going to make it very difficult with regard to continuing to pick up the tab for both Ukraine and now Israel, for example, which of course the United States had already been supplying. But this is different because the United States picks up the tab for about 150,000 Ukrainian civil servants, and they may have to do the same for Israel, given the fact that 300,000 plus reservists, weekend warriors, equivalent U.S. National Guard, are now in green fatigues. A few days ago, they were stocking grocery shelves and office cubicles. I'm not sure if it's sustainable in the long term for the United States to then pick up the tab for that country as well as Ukraine at the same time when China's in the passing lane. You could make an argument that the BRICS are in the passing lane. And it's a very serious challenge. I'm not sure how it's going to eventuate, but you know, there's a line coming out of certain elements whose names I will not mention, who are very disparaging of the BRICS because they look at India, for example, under Modi, which is one of the few countries in the global South, so-called the global majority, that seems to be sympathetic to Israel and sort of an anti-Muslim, right-wing chauvinist Hindu regime. And of course, I don't have to share with this audience some of the complaints that are made about South Africa. But I think that it's clear that the BRICS, they're heterogeneous. This is not the Communist International, to put it mildly. It's a very heterogeneous organization with different trends. But I think that the overall trend is a sort of unhappiness with the status quo, unhappiness with the dollar. I was mentioning borrowing costs the other day, and of course, China's dumping its treasury bills. This is what the US Treasury gets loans and has to pay back the money eventually. 0% interest rates, I think, are a thing of the past, which will not only have knock-on effects in terms of borrowing costs for the government, have knock-on effects in terms of Washington, D.C. I noticed walking around town, all of these empty condos going up, empty office buildings. I'm not sure how your leaders are going to resolve that crisis. Maybe they won't be able to resolve that crisis. So anyway, that's my response with regard to BRICS.
Good evening, Dr. Horne. I'm sorry, did we stop?
Oh, no, go right ahead.
Good evening, Dr. Horne. Thanks for being here. So could you please share your thoughts about the new movie, Killers of the Flower?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. I haven't seen it yet. I plan to see it next week, though.
Okay.
Because I had to read the book do my Texas book.
Okay, so luckily I have a follow-up question to that.
Oh, okay.
Had you seen the movie, I was gonna ask you if you could please make the connection to the fact that as the filmmaker, the Haitian Bronx native filmmaker Raoul Peck, he had a film that came out called Exterminator.
Oh, yes, I saw that one.
So if you're familiar with that as well, maybe you can make the comparison. So my question would be, with the Killers of the Flower of the Moon, and then Raoul Peck's movie coming out, it kind of deals with the same concept. Do you ever think that the United States would ever come to grips with holding themselves accountable in terms of currently we know that the 50 states of the so-called United States, all of it was Native American land. So do you ever think that they would hold themselves accountable regarding that?
Well, first of all, with regard to Raoul Peck's film, I recommend it. Exterminate All the Brutes. And it's part of a trend. I mentioned that in my I Dare Say book, the Gerald Horne reader, which will be out shortly. That is to say, the trend being that Black intellectuals in particular are reassessing the origins of the United States of America. The late historian Tyler Stovall, in his book White Freedom, which is a critique not only of 1776, but the French Revolution. Before he passed, he was probably our leading scholar of France. I think of Raoul Peck's work, the work by our paramount intellectual Ishmael Reed, his spoof of Hamilton, the Disney extravaganza, which, as you know, has taken not only the United States by storm, they're cast all over the world. It's sort of a glorification of 1776. Even the 1619 Project by your colleague across the street. So there's this ongoing trend, which, as I said, I don't think that many of our friends on the left have picked up on it. As a matter of fact, let me also once again give a shout out to these interviews I do on KPFK. Just a week or two ago, I interviewed the scholar Alex Baruchi of UC Irvine. He has an article out now that you can find, but he's doing a book with this provocative thesis that George Washington and his comrades were financed heavily, not only by the French, which most of us knew, but by the Spanish, who in return they opened up their ports from Cuba to Buenos Aires for the U.S., or excuse me, the Patriots to bring in enslaved Africans. That's how they financed this revolt, which obviously calls into question this propaganda that the creation of the United States was a great leap forward for abolitionism. Actually, it was the opposite. Alex Barucki, B-O-R-U-C-K-I. I interviewed him. So there's this gathering trend, and I see the Scorsese DiCaprio movie as being part of this trend. Now, how this is going to work out, it's hard to say. I mean, usually when I speak to a lot of young people, and thankfully many of them are full of vim and vigor. They always try to get to my left, which is fine. And so they challenged me, and one of them put me in a corner, and I had to say that I think eventually what's going to happen in the United States, as I was thinking it through, is that at some point, maybe not in my lifetime, maybe not in your lifetime, but there's going to have to be some sort of Lancaster House talks. Recall how Rhodesia turned into Zimbabwe? There were talks in London between the colonizer and the indigenous with regard to a settlement, which, of course, the bad guys sought to renege on. But I think ultimately there's going to have to be some sort of Lancaster House talks involving North America, where London is going to have to be involved because they helped to start this mess. And on one side of the table would be London and its descendants. On the other side of the table will be the indigenous, perhaps the Negroes as well. Who knows? Maybe the Negroes will be on the same side of the table. That's London. You never know. But yeah, I plan to see that movie. I'm looking forward to it. You saw it, I take it.
Yeah, I saw it.
There's a lot of Native American discussion in the movie that seems it as horrendous.
Well, you know, I talk about part of that, you know, in my Texas book. There's a lot of Oklahoma history. And as I said about the Cherokees, you know, some of the indigenous, not all, but, you know, Cherokees, Choctaws, Chickasaw to a degree, and they were enslavers. And so, but they have to move to the land of the Indians, Indian territory, for as long as the rivers shall flow and the grass shall grow. That's going to be their land, allegedly. And of course, it didn't work out. Many of them, of course, sided with the Confederacy, which gives the Washington, the U.S. government, an excuse for putting the screws to them, much more than other enslavers. They have to regurgitate and relinquish more of their wealth to their enslaved population, which is a continuing issue with them being citizens of these indigenous nations, which then brings us to Tulsa about a century or so ago, because one of the reasons why the Black people in Tulsa had a fair amount of wealth is because 60 years previously, the indigenous enslavers had to give it up to them. And then the settlers said, we're not going for that. So they come in and plunder, pillage the Black people, send them fleeing, take up the land. So it's like an analog to the Scorsese DiCaprio movie in terms of how the settlers, they're not tolerating any but themselves controlling a certain amount of wealth.
Any more questions? Okay, I think we'll make this the last one. We do want to have time for Dr. Horne to sign the book.
Okay, terrifying for the last question, but you've invoked fascism a few times in this discussion tonight, and in the book you mentioned in your Paul Robeson interview chapter on fascism. I was wondering, how do you understand how fascism has evolved? How do you understand that fascism is a term that's involved, and particularly its American variants, as opposed to, again, just reciting European versions of what fascism is?
Well, that's a good question, because we know there are different kinds of capitalism. You know, the capitalism in Norway is far distant from the capitalism in the United States. Or even if you look at the right wing, a part of the right wing in Poland, for example, they are in favor of social welfare benefits. As a matter of fact, Madame Le Pen, who made succeed Macron, that's part of her line too. Just not to the immigrants, not to the so-called non-indigenous. Whereas in the United States, the right wing, as I said, Speaker Johnson, he says he's willing to wreck Social Security and Medicare for everybody. It's going to be difficult, but I guess not impossible to say, well, I mean, because you recall what happened in Virginia during the era of anti-Jim Crow in the late 1950s, when they decided to close the schools. And then the Negro children were deprived of public schools, but then they had subsidies arranged by various means for the children of the settlers so they could continue education. So I'm imagining that if they wreck Social Security and Medicare, they're going to have to try to have a carve out for the Euro-American working class and poor. I don't. It's difficult to see how that's going to work. But, these people are devious. They'll probably come up with something. So I think that's part of the difference, say, between the European right and the U.S. right. This question of social welfare benefits. I think, as well, one of the reasons I began by saying that Black people should have some sort of backup plan in case our anti-fascist efforts do not succeed is because our community is going to be, just as now, will be a major target and a major victim. We see a premonition of that with regard to these police shootings and police killings, for example. I mean, that's obviously a very ominous signal and sign to the point where you may look back to the days of Sandra Bland and Breonna Taylor as the good old days, for example. So, but I'm confident that we'll be able to get it together, overcome. And in any event, thank you very much for your rapt attention, and I'll see you.
Keep it going, keep it going, keep it going. Thank you so much, Dr. Horne, for making us a stop on your, I'm sure, very busy schedule. I know you won't be here for long. And we have copies of the book available in the back. And if we run out back there, we have some up here. And Dr. Horne, we'll give him a break, and then he can sign some copies. Right. Cool. And without holding this up any longer, I invite you all to stand up and make a beeline to the back. And if there are too many people, I also have a second post that we can set up to make it more convenient for you all. Thank you so much for coming out. We really appreciate it. And enjoy and have a safe night.
All right,